"Dad, you're leaving." 3 words, said without heat, without a shout, said like a measurement, precise, unarguable. I was standing in the doorway of the house I had drawn, poured and raised with my own hands. The evening light lay along the brick path where Eleanor and I had walked for 38 years. The porch swing creaked its usual small complaint in the breeze, and Michael had set a single canvas bag on the threshold. He looked at me as if he were reading the dimensions of a plan. I picked up the bag and walked away. That opening moment is often the one people remember when I tell the story. The doorway, the bag, the 3 words. It is not sensational because of raised voices or theatrical gestures. It is stark because of what it compresses. A life's work reduced in a single motion to a choice no elder wants to make. I am Thomas Edward Callaway. I am 72. I was an architect for nearly 45 years. I built that house for Eleanor and me. Every beam has a name in my head. Our life there was not only measured in blueprints but in coffee stains along the kitchen counter, in the exact curve of the porch swing that echoed her laugh, in the harbor light that struck the dining room at sunset. It mattered. 5 days after Eleanor's burial, I found a folder on the kitchen table. Michael had placed it there with the same quiet I knew from his childhood, businesslike, eyes on the task. Inside were voluntary transfer papers. He told me, in a voice that suggested practicality rather than accusation, that it would be simpler if I signed. It would make things easier for them, he said, and for me. I read the documents, set them down, and asked for time. He left, returning that night with the bag and those 3 small words. I did not argue. I did not shout. There was nothing theatrical in me anymore. Grief has a way of making your movements economy, everything pared down to essentials. I packed 1 bag, a cardigan Eleanor liked, a few shirts, the pocket watch my father gave me when I started my apprenticeship, and the blue coffee mug that never quite fit any dishwasher. I walked past rooms that held years of laughter and quiet disputes, past the drawings pinned to the study wall, schematics that had once consumed my mind, and out the door. The first night I slept at the Francis Marion Hotel. The room gave onto the harbor, a small civilized view of sailboats chasing the late light. There was a club sandwich on the bedside table because, for the first time in months, I did not feel like cooking. The hotel bed smelled of linen and distance. I slept better that night than I had in 6 months. I tell you the hotel detail because there is a peculiar clarifying quality to reduced space. In that small room, with the harbor a horizon line I could almost reach, the noise that had lived in the house, the small domestic frictions, the heavy invisibility of Eleanor's absence, began to separate into what was essential and what was not. When your life is measured again by the rectangle of a hotel mattress, you find what you can carry and what you cannot. For me, that meant a decision. I would not sign the papers without understanding the reasons, and I would not be hurried out of the life Eleanor and I had built. I moved into a small apartment not long after, a compact place with a single window and a shelf of books that felt like ballast. I walked every morning along the brick path of the neighborhood and down to the harbor. The clarity that reduced space affords was relentless. Grief settled into the corners, but it also made room for questions. Why had Michael set those papers out when he did, 5 days after Eleanor's funeral? Why had he not waited, not asked, not simply sat with me in silence? The weeks that followed were quieter than I had anticipated and more complicated. Michael and Amanda, his wife, who had come into our family in a gentler storm than the rest of it, began to move. A realtor appeared on the block, measuring tape in hand. The realtor was courteous enough, professional. He took photographs of an empty room, as if the house had already emptied itself. Neighbors saw moving boxes at the back door. Patricia Haynes, who had lived across the lane and who had once brought over rhubarb pie, stopped to say she would check on the garden and asked if I needed anything. I said no. I wanted to see with my own eyes what was happening. At the 6-week mark after I had walked out, I met with James Whitaker, my attorney of many years, the man who had handled the papers for my business and who had been a steady, practical presence since Eleanor's diagnosis. We met at his office, which smells of old leather and ink, the way old law offices do. James had been a friend once. Over time, he had become someone who could hold facts without drama. He brought a binder and set it on the table between us. He looked at me and said simply that there was something I should know about. "Thomas," he said, "there's a trust. The Whitmore Trust." For 3 weeks I carried the echo of that phrase like an instrument with a broken string. I had handled trusts, estate plans, and deeds for clients. But this was different. James told me as plainly as he could that the Whitmore Trust existed and that I was the trustee. He read the number once and only once, $28,200,000. I did not shout. I did not make a scene. The room was small, James' voice steady. "Here is what matters. The amount is a fact I will not enlarge or exaggerate. It is part of the story because it illuminates the stakes and the secrecy around them." For weeks, Michael's actions had suggested urgency over the house, a belief that possession might equal control. The money, I realized, explained why the urgency had pressed in the way it did. There was another paper in James's file, a deed restriction filed in 2020. It prevented the sale or structural alteration of the house without my written consent. I had placed it there years before, a quiet measure of protection. The house had always been more than an asset to me. It was an idea I had built with Eleanor. The restriction was not about money, I had told the recorder's office when I filed it. It was about preserving the integrity of what we had created. The deed expressed a refusal to let someone reduce the house to the highest bidder without regard to what it meant to the people who lived there. When James told me the facts, I felt both relief and a strange, slow sorrow. Relief that some parts of the house's future could not be decided without my say. Sorrow because the existence of the trust and the restriction had been secrets, quiet ones that now loomed loud in the space between me and my son. Secrets have an odd weight. They can protect. They can wound. Michael's reaction to these revelations was not the stuff of melodrama. When I called him, 6 weeks after I had left, the exact timeline he and I both knew. My voice was the same steady, measured voice I had used with clients for decades. I explained to him plainly that the deed restriction was binding and that the Whitmore Trust existed with me as trustee. I told him the amount. There was a silence on the line that lasted 14 seconds. In the economy of my life, 14 seconds is a long time. It is a length of breath in which a city grazes the sky in a single stripe. I remember counting the seconds like an architect might count off columns. The long pause was full, not empty, full of things unsaid and perhaps of shame, of surprise. When Michael finally spoke, he did not rage. He did not accuse. He said very simply, "I," and then a break. And then his voice came back smaller, the way it does when a man is trying to find words in a grief that is no longer young. He told me that he had thought the house would pass easily, that signing would be routine, that he was protecting the family, that Amanda had been frightened by what she thought might be instability to their own life. He explained clumsily and haltingly that he had set the transfer out of a sense of duty that had curdled into a kind of fear. During those words I could hear an undercurrent, not a plot, but influence, a pressure that had been building since Eleanor's decline. He apologized. The apology came without dramatic absolution. It was a man reaching across a gulf that had opened between him and his father, trying to build a bridge from unfamiliar materials. I listened. I did not forgive in the way people envision, an immediate, clean erasure of the hurt. Instead, forgiveness began as an inhalation, a decision to hear beyond immediate offense. When Michael arrived at the house in person a few days later, the encounter was unglamorous. We sat at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee that had gone cold. There was no grand gesture of renunciation of prior actions, no exchange of legal documents. He looked at the scar on my hand, where I once cut an old floorboard, and for a moment he looked like the boy who had learned to use a chisel under my direction. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad," in the way a man sometimes says apologies when he wants to be someone else than fear has made him. Amanda sat with him, and she looked tired, the bearing of someone who has been carrying uncertainty and trying to steer a family through it. We spoke about Eleanor. We spoke about the porch swing. Michael told me that he remembered her voice when she would argue gently with me about window trim, and that he had once wished I had some of her patience. He admitted that, in the weeks after her funeral, he and Amanda had felt untethered. He said that the house felt like a responsibility too large for them to bear alone. "We thought taking steps would make it easier," he said, and there was apology in the way he let the sentence fall. I told him I would not sign away the house or the trust. I would not alter the Whitmore trust at his request. I would not remove the deed restriction. Those were not bargains I would make lightly, not because of the money, but because of promise, the kind of promise you find in a marriage and the kind you make to a life's work. Eleanor had once said quietly that the house should stand as a thing of steadiness, not of convenience, and I found that her words had lodged in me like a foundation stone. That refusal did not drive us apart permanently. Instead, it forced an honest conversation. Michael needed to recognize why he had acted the way he did. Fear, grief, and, perhaps most real, a misdirected sense of obligation. He needed to grow into a son Eleanor had hoped for. Someone who could hold his grief and his respect for his parents simultaneously. I needed to reclaim a voice I had let soften in the face of potential conflict. That reclamation was not a blow. It was a set of small, precise rearticulations. This is mine, this is not yours to decide, and you may choose to respect that or leave with your own conscience. The symbolic moment of our reconciliation occurred on the porch. The swing had been taken down in the flurry after Eleanor died. Michael had been the one to remove it, thinking to make it easier on me. On a damp evening when the light turned gold and slow, he climbed the ladder and rehung the swing himself. His hands were careful, not because he feared the mechanics, but because something else had shifted in him. A tenderness, perhaps, a recognition of what he had nearly traded away for an easier future. We sat together and let the swing creak in its old rhythm. The porch smelled of salt and iron and the faint perfume Eleanor always favored. There was no grand pronouncement. There was coffee gone cold on the table, a small plate with crumbs, and the ordinary sound of the harbor in the distance. Michael told me in halting phrases that he wanted to try to be the man Eleanor had seen in him, a man who could be honest, not someone who tried to avoid pain by erasing history. There are lessons within this story that are not about law or money. I will state the facts as they happened precisely because the emotional architecture is what I came to teach myself. The Whitmore Trust is real. The amount was $28,200,000, and I am the trustee. The deed restriction was filed in 2020 and stands as I placed it, a measure to protect the house's character. These details did not become weapons in a family fight. They became anchors that allowed us to speak more honestly. What matters to me now, and what I want to press on those of you listening who are older or who live with elders, is simple. Do not make yourself smaller to avoid a confrontation that will only grow in time. There is a dignity in occupying the space you have built. There is also a responsibility that comes with age, the responsibility to protect the memory of those who shared your life, and the responsibility to push back when your autonomy is at risk. That pushback need not be strident. It can be a deed restriction quietly filed, a conversation initiated with your longtime attorney, a single bag packed for one night that clarifies what you will and will not tolerate. I do not tell this story as a manual for battles. I tell it as a map of how a family can find its way back from a strange rupture. Michael is not a villain. He is my son, flawed, loving, frightened, and capable of regret. Amanda is not a conspirator. She is a woman trying to navigate the aftermath of a death and the responsibilities of a marriage. Grief did strange things to all of us. The $28,200,000 was a truth that reframed the situation. But the real work was not about redistributing wealth. It was about returning to one another in honesty and learning to hold memory and future in a single open hand. When I look back at the porch swing now, it is less a symbol of property than of continuity. The swing carried Eleanor's laugh for 38 years. It carries mine and Michael's now in a different register. Reconciliation did not mean erasing mistakes. It meant building again on a foundation that includes truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. If there is one practical note I will allow myself, because the story invites it, and not because I give legal advice, it is this. Make your intentions known clearly, and protect the things that hold your life together before you are under pressure to cede them. The deed restriction I filed in 2020 was not cleverness. It was an act of preservation. The Whitmore Trust existed because Eleanor and I planned in ways we thought prudent. How you choose to set those things up is a matter for professionals and your conscience, not for the heat of a sudden crisis. 3 weeks in a hotel teaches you what is necessary. 6 weeks of distance teach you how to hear grief in someone else's voice. 14 seconds on a phone line can be the measure of a man's shame and the first breath of his apology. The porch swing will creak whether you sit alone or with someone attempting to return. I tell this story because I think many older people give up pieces of themselves too soon, and many children miscalculate grief as entitlement. My hope, my earnest wish, is that families might slow down long enough to speak openly, to allow old loyalties and new responsibilities to find their shape without breaking the things that really matter. If this story landed with you, if it stirred something you are sitting on, please subscribe for more true life accounts like this. If you know someone who is navigating the loss of a spouse or tension with an adult child, share this with them. Stories like these matter because they remind us what dignity looks like when it must be defended not with fireworks, but with steady hands. In the end, I did not give Michael the house. I did not dissolve the trust. What I offered instead was a space for him to grow into a son who could accept limits and find a new kind of presence. The price was not money, the price was honesty. We are rebuilding, slowly and carefully, and the porch swing creaks the way it always has. Familiar, resilient, and resolute. Leave a comment if you have a story like this. Tell me how your family found its way through something that felt impossible. Subscribe if you want to hear more of these kinds of stories. Thank you for listening.